As a brigadier general of the German army and chief of one of its most important intelligence branches, it had never occurred to me that late in August 1945, I would find myself seated with a number of my former staff officers in an American Air Transport Command DC-3, flying the standard of a 3-star U.S. Army general on my way to Washington, D.C. We must have seemed an unlikely bunch of civilians to be crossing the Atlantic at that time. We had been given only 3 days to obtain the necessary civilian clothes to exchange for our Wehrmacht uniforms, and to lay hands on such suitcases as we could before departing for the United States. On no account were we to be recognizable as former soldiers, for the Russians particularly had begun to ask their former allies where I was. Fitting us out in plain clothes was no easy matter in a Germany pulverized from one end to the other by air raids and the general ravages of war. I had to beg and borrow to obtain the most urgent items from my friends. It was an even taller order to get suitcases at such short notice, and in the end we had to improvise with the most motley collection of receptacles. Colonel Stephanus, one of my intelligence officers, had had to ram his few effects into an empty violin case. Perhaps people who saw us took us for members of a string sextet, unless they had happened to see us embark on this transatlantic flight on the personal aircraft of General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. The charade remained successful, despite one curious incident. When we touched down in the Azores for a brief refueling in mid-Atlantic, we found the local community had drawn up an honor guard to welcome Bedell Smith, whom they obviously assumed was aboard the plane. None of us had ever been to the United States, but though we were curious as to what lay ahead, the mood was anything but one of exhilaration. 36 hours of flying lay ahead. I reflected on the events of the last few months. It was 5 months or more since I had last seen Hitler. On February 27, 1945, Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the Army's Chief of Staff, had taken me with him to the Bismarck Room of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, where the Führer still held his war conferences. The last German offensive in the West had collapsed, and he had returned to the Reich capital in January to direct the defence against the Russian onslaught in the East. Hitler had long planned to strike at the exposed northern flank of the Soviet invaders from Pomerania on the Baltic coast, but I had warned him in my intelligence summaries that there were clear indications that the Russians intended to thwart this by acting first to cut off the Pomeranian forces altogether from the Reich. On February 24th, my prediction had been confirmed. Russian tank forces had knifed through our Pomeranian line almost without effort, and they were poised to advance on Danzig and the Baltic Sea. In a desperate move, Hitler ordered Army Group Vistula, commanded by the SS chief Heinrich Himmler, to defend at all costs the road and rail links with Danzig, the very corridor of land over which he had ostensibly gone to war in 1939. I reported to Hitler the unvarnished facts about the Russian tank strength opposing Himmler figures we had pieced together over the previous weeks from prisoners of war and deserters. Then I returned to my barrack headquarters in the woods at Zossen, to the south of Berlin. I had also suggested to Hitler that we use amplified phonograph records of tank tracks, marching feet, and the other sound effects of massive reinforcements arriving to persuade the Russians that we had built up a particularly powerful and impregnable line of defence between the River Oder and Berlin. There was little else that we could offer. We had called up our last reserves, and in the final fighting for Berlin, even youngsters would be put in uniform to man bazookas against the Russian tanks. Hitler adopted the sound effects idea, issued the necessary orders on March 5, 1945, and ordered my dismissal as Chief of Eastern Intelligence a month later. There is nobody less popular than a prophet of misfortune whose predictions have been proved true in every detail. Now I was in a plane bound for Washington. It had taken some time to persuade the Americans that they would be needing an Eastern intelligence service. After going into hiding in the Bavarian mountains for the first uneasy weeks after the final collapse, I had surrendered to the Americans on May 22nd, along with 4 of my principal staff officers. Early that Tuesday morning, we had set out from our mountain hut, with our knapsacks on our backs, for the nearby town of Fischhausen on Lake Schliersee, where the Americans had set up their town headquarters. I well recall my feelings, a grim humour at the situation, as I, a brigadier general who had played a not unimportant part in the war, had to turn myself over to a young American first lieutenant in the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC. But there was no going back now. The town commandant was understandably quite agitated when a general and 4 staff officers suddenly reported to him. We were unable to enlighten him as to just what a catch he had made, since he could speak no German and we no English. He excitedly telephoned his superiors, and they told him to send us one at a time to headquarters at Wörgl. I went first, loaded into a military police jeep, and delivered to the CIC unit commander at Wörgl. He interrogated me in the presence of a uniformed female secretary, who took notes on everything I said. I remember being somewhat disappointed that his main questions were concerned less with my pharma specialization as chief of the Army's Eastern Intelligence Branch than with the situation in Germany under Adolf Hitler. I was then sent on to Salzburg to Counterintelligence Corps headquarters, but the military police officers driving me evidently could not locate the building. After driving me back and forth for some time, they finally bundled me into an inn, in the tap room of which there was already another prisoner. The other prisoner was soon taken away, and I was left alone, while a sentry stood guard outside, armed to the teeth, with a machine pistol at the ready should I try to get away. After 3 days had passed and nothing had happened, I suggested to an American officer who came into the deserted inn that it was high time that I was taken to the Corps' headquarters, but it was heavy going to make ourselves understood. When at last he realized what I was talking about, he burst out, "We FR got all about you," and promised to look into the matter at once. Some time later, the military police returned and ordered me to pack my bags. I was put into a jeep and driven off to Augsburg, 150 miles away, where the US 7th Army had its big interrogation center. The center was a compound consisting of a large number of small but attractive detached and semi-detached villas. They were divided into 4 or 6 apartments of 2 or 3 rooms each, the ideal accommodation for prisoners awaiting interrogation, since we were unable to contact each other to compare notes if we wished. Until now, I had met only American officers. Almost without exception, these men viewed the situation in accord with official US propaganda. They believed the Soviet Union would eventually develop out of its communist phase into a liberal state. Stalin was always referred to as Uncle Joe. Not one of my interlocutors had shown the slightest recognition of the real expansionist aims of the Soviet government. I was held for about 3 or 4 weeks at this disappointing Augsburg camp, while my interrogating officer, who was evidently a German émigré, gradually satisfied himself that I was not a particularly valuable prisoner. He could not have been less interested in the Soviet threat. He was concerned only with domestic German affairs and episodes. Or, alternatively, he would ask me about purely organizational matters and personalities, and on these scores I said little. But wheels must have been whirring within wheels somewhere, for one day my door was flung open and a voice bellowed, "Get packed! Get packed!" and I was off again. I was loaded into a truck with various other officers, most of them complete strangers to me, and we drove for many hours in the general direction of Stuttgart and Frankfurt. When we reached Wiesbaden, I was told I was a Gestapo general, and despite my indignant denials, I was thrown into Wiesbaden prison. Here the American personnel were uncharitable, to say the least. For a time I even feared from their manner that there would be violence. But as I was being marched down a corridor, I found myself suddenly face to face with my old chief, General Franz Halder, who had been sacked as Chief of Staff by Hitler in 1942. With his granite face, pince-nez spectacles and close-cropped hair, there could be no mistaking him. Overwhelmed by spontaneous joy at this unexpected reunion, we slapped each other on the back and congratulated each other. The Americans were sufficiently impressed by this display to moderate their attitude toward me from that moment on. Halder belonged to that unfortunate group of civilians and officers whom the Americans had liberated from various concentration camps, only to incarcerate them again themselves. Most of them belonged to the conspiracy to take Hitler's life on July 20th, 1944. At Wiesbaden, I also caught sight of Hermann Tinder, the pre-193-3 State Secretary in the Reich Chancellery, Nicholas von Horthy, the former regent of Hungary, and Admiral Dönitz, whom Hitler had appointed his successor. I was housed together with them at Villa Pagenstecher, part of the main interrogation center run by the US 12th Army Group under its G2, Major General Edwin L. Seibert. So I had not been shelved at Augsburg, as I had at first feared. At Wiesbaden there were a number of civilian and military prisoners whom the Americans evidently considered important for political or military reasons. On the first morning after my arrival there, I was led downstairs into the garden, where a Captain John Boker invited me to join him on a bench in the sunshine. He was smartly dressed and of cultivated manners. He was perhaps 35, and in his bearing and demeanour every inch an officer, as we understood the term in Germany. I later learned that he did in fact have some German blood in him, being a third-generation American of German ancestry. I know more about Boker now than I did then. During the previous few weeks he had handled the German Air Force intelligence group commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Holters. This group had surrendered to the US Third Army and had been sent to an interrogation center where Boker had formed a small special unit to work with them. That was where Boker had gained his first unflattering impressions of the CIC and of the Army's document collection groups, which were interested only in shipping documents back to the United States without any instinct for exploiting the German personnel who had previously been working on the documents. Boker had taught German army organization and tactics at Camp Ritchie, and before that he had been assigned to an interrogation center outside Washington, which I was to come to know better myself. One of Baker's friends from Camp Ritchie had told him that if he could fill a quota of 15 tons of captured documents, he could accompany the shipment back across the Atlantic. With that kind of pressure on, he was clearly going to have to act fast if we were not going to lose our main documents. Captain Boker was the first American officer I met with expert knowledge of Russia and with no illusions about the way political events were turning. He had formed his own ideas about the future. In retrospect, I can see that meeting him was one of the most crucial stages in the development of my plans. Our meetings retained their official character for only a relatively short time. After our initial reserve toward one another had been overcome, we became close friends and have remained so to this day. We had a long talk that morning about the political and military situation. He asked detailed questions about my former work, which I answered only partially. After he left, I spent the night thinking things over, deciding whether to lay my cards on the table. Buried in various secret locations in the Bavarian mountains, I had the most important files and indices of my former intelligence branch. I had an organization in embryo which I was prepared to offer to the Americans for intelligence work against the Soviet Union. Was this the moment to reveal this to my captors? When I next met Boker, at first I did not show my full hand. We circled each other warily in several further conversations, while I put out such feelers as I could to him, gradually disclosing my own ideas about the future and my ambitions and intentions. I assumed that he was perhaps keeping his superiors, Bedell Smith and Seibert, fully informed on our talks, and that he was instructed to lend me a sympathetic ear. At any rate, with each day that passed, he became increasingly frank in his remarks. I now know that at that time Captain Boker was acting on his own when he listened to my plans for the reconstitution of my wartime group. There were still too many hostile officers, people with blind hatred of the Germans. This was understandable enough, but there were also US military officers who believed they could cooperate with the Russians. There existed highest-level directives to the effect that any German documents concerning the Soviet Union and any German officers and personnel involved in Eastern area activities were to be turned over to the Russians. Boker feared, he later told me, that if he had reported our existence too early to Frankfurt and the Pentagon, we might have become exposed to these hostile forces, and then we would have been beyond salvation. Instead, he discussed the problem with the commanding officer of his interrogation group, Colonel W.R., Philp, an officer of whom I still have the fondest memories. Boker had formed an unusually close relationship with this colonel, and the colonel gave him carte blanche to form his own completely independent section to deal with us, reporting only to him. Boker and Philp suspected that there was a Russian infiltrator in the interrogation organization at their level. Boker and I agreed that I should send for a small number of my former colleagues from the other prison camps, so that the Americans could judge for themselves the specialized knowledge that we had. I signed a number of letters for him and gave him the names of the 7 officers I had picked so that he could identify them from the prisoner of war lists and have them transferred to Wiesbaden. Boker secured Philp's permission to go out in the field and bring them in himself, to avoid going through regular channels which might have attracted attention to these prisoners. He himself collected Gerhard Wessel, who had succeeded me in April, and Major Heimans from the camp at Bad Aibling, and drove them to me in his open jeep. I had also listed Colonel Stephanus, Major Hinrichs, Major Steiner, a Russo-German we dubbed Papushka, and 2 others. It took several days to collect them all. When he returned, Boker told me with a grin that at first he had spoken to each of my men without showing them the letter in which I authorized them to cooperate with him. Without exception, they had been completely unreceptive until he had produced the letter. Boker made no secret of how much this had impressed him. At about the same time, Boker had our names removed from the prisoner of war lists that were in circulation. He was concerned because the Russian liaison officers had access to these lists, and our joint effort could still end in tragedy. As my officers arrived at Wiesbaden, he had them housed without official registration in the Villa Pagenstecher, and no access was permitted to us except by Baker's unit. As for our hidden archives of wartime intelligence documents, some had remained undiscovered in the fields where they lay buried. I sent out my men from Wiesbaden, and these caches were retrieved. Others already had been found by American military units, and Boker was able to locate them, though not without some difficulty, in view of the discretion involved in a document collection warehouse near Frankfurt. His unit produced a blanket requisition from Frankfurt Army headquarters to have an entire section from the warehouse delivered to 2 of his officers. They drove over in a 2.5-ton truck and returned with a vast load of documents and a printing press, only part of which belonged to my group. The printing press, with its boxes, CF-forged stamps and other paraphernalia, had formed part of a Russian line crosser outfitting section. It had been used to forge German paybooks and other papers. Thus, the first step had been taken. A small number of my closest colleagues was once again at my disposal, and my files and archives had been reassembled under one roof. We were in a position to negotiate. My talks with Captain Boker returned repeatedly to the same point. The collapse of the East-West alliance could only be a matter of time. A conflict of interests was bound to break out between East and West, and this would jeopardize the safety of Europe and of the United States. So how could we reach agreement as rapidly as possible on suitable terms for collaboration? Neither of us had any doubts about the problems which lay ahead. Boker feared that my group might still be broken up for individual interrogation by various agencies, and that our documents would be removed and sent directly to Washington. Even if after some months we were reunited, he felt that our morale would have suffered so much that even the loyalty my officers displayed would not prove strong enough. I had proposed to Boker that our intelligence potential should be put to work for the United States quite independently of the US Army's G2 military intelligence, but in collaboration with it. But Boker was aware that there was no provision or policy whatsoever for the utilization of German personnel of any kind for what amounted to espionage against America's Russian allies. Indeed, there was considerable opposition to such a plan, as he was in the process of finding out. On the other hand, the G2 service did not conceal its ignorance of Uncle Joe and his vast empire, so our offer must have been a sore temptation, as we deduced from our talks with the G2 officers. It would save them a massive organizational effort and afford them access to information and expertise that would take them years to collect under their own steam. Soviet military manuals, the complete order of battle of the Red Army, digests on Russian industrial and economic strength, not to mention an existing espionage network behind the Iron Curtain. But uppermost in the Western public's mind was still the image of the Soviet Union as a friend and ally in victory, a nation of benevolence and democratic intentions. And had not the Americans fought this war to stamp out Prussian militarism? How could American public opinion be expected to tolerate their officers collaborating with former German officers and members of the German intelligence service, in view of the hideous crimes committed by the Nazis' crimes, which among other things had resulted in Eisenhower's policy of non-fraternization. Ambassador William C. Bullitt, a close confidant of President Roosevelt, was to write in 1946 that Roosevelt had died in the knowledge that he had used Beelzebub to drive out the devil, and that the United States was now facing its most serious danger. But I recall Bullitt added that it would take about 5 years for this fact to sink in a democracy. Nor was he proved wrong in his prophecy. While the American attitude toward the Soviet Union was shaken by the entry of Russian troops into Persia at the end of 1945, it was not until the Korean War that the American public opened its eyes to reality. Captain Boker decided to influence Colonel Philp to bring General Sieber over to our side. Siebert's aide was Colonel Sapieha, who was already a realist as far as America's future relations with the Russians were concerned. But more importantly, Philp was a close friend of Siebert and an artillery colonel. Boker came to me and asked us to prepare the best report we possibly could on Russian artillery. This was to be a piece de resistance to climax a dinner party his unit arranged to present us to the colonel. We also wrote a detailed report on the line-crossing activities of Russian agents at the end of the war, which had been on such a scale that there could be no doubt, but that this would soon be a major source of trouble for the Western Allies. For Boker, this was the point of no return. He later told me that Philp had been so impressed by the professional nature of our reports that he had immediately taken up the question of our future with General Siebert. There was no way around this if Siebert was to be convinced of our integrity and our desire to serve the West unselfishly. But this attention also meant that we were now exposed to the hostile glare of the other Allied agencies, who only now learned of our presence in Wiesbaden. For a long time, our future was in the balance. Given the political situation in August 1945, it was understandable that nothing could be decided at once. Perhaps it was not a decision that could be made by the American commanders in Europe anyway. Boker told me years later that it soon became apparent that the Pentagon wanted to have all our documents sent over to Washington, but not us. There was absolutely no desire to have us continue working. But he had been able to persuade Siebert's headquarters that these documents should not be separated from the experts concerned, and that we must be persuaded to cooperate. Siebert, in fact, would have liked us to stay right where we were and keep the documents as well, but this was overruled by the Pentagon. That was how I and a handful of my colleagues came to be sitting in General Bedell Smith's personal plane, flying to Washington at a time when the Russians were still dealing as allies with the other 3 powers in London over plans to prosecute the war criminals. I left Wessel in Europe with Boker's Lieutenant Comstock to act as my locum tenens in my absence. The agreement we had struck remained in force. He was to undertake no active operations for the Americans without my written authority. But short of that, he was to try to maintain contact with any of our former colleagues who might prove useful in the future men, such as Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Baun, who had controlled our espionage activities in the Soviet Union. Clearly, one reason for shifting us to America was a desire to reduce the risk of an indiscretion in Europe. By now we had all been deleted from the American prisoner of war lists, with the curious result that as late as 1949, the Counterintelligence Corps still had me on their wanted lists. On the other hand, our shift to Washington would enable negotiations and discussions to be conducted in a more conducive atmosphere than the turmoil of war-torn Europe. Our plane came in low over the Potomac River and landed at Washington's National Airport after 36 hours of flying. It was parked at the end of the field and surrounded by sentries. We were met by a U.S. Army captain who was to be responsible for us at first, and by a uniformed official of the Department of Agriculture who was looking for any contraband plants we might be trying to import into the United States. He was totally uninterested in the possibility that we might be bringing anything of greater value for the West with us. To our disappointment, Captain Boker, who had developed into a sort of faithful Eckhart as time had passed, and who had accompanied us in the plane, took leave of us at the airport. He did tell me, however, that he would try and see me again the next day. Kohler escorted us cordially to an arrival lounge. There we had to undergo a medical examination. Sitting on a bench with thermometers stuck into our mouths, we looked for all the world like a row of sparrows on a twig. Something about this reception made me vaguely uneasy. We were led out of the airport building and loaded into a van with no windows and just one barely adequate ventilating slot. I could see that my travelling companions were equally taken aback by this transport and all it seemed to imply. As the van started its journey, I tried to work out where we were heading by sensing the van's change of direction and timing each stretch of road between. When it finally stopped, we were about 15 miles south of Washington by my calculations. I guessed we were in Alexandria, Virginia, and this later turned out to be about right. We were at Fort Hunt Interrogation Camp, although it was not identified to us for security reasons. The American soldiers referred to it only as Post Office Box 1142. The ugly building was surrounded by a barbed wire fence and guarded by 4 watchtowers. We dubbed it Truman's Hotel. In it, there was an adequately furnished room for each of us, but with one feature that struck us all as odd. There was no doorknob inside the room, so the occupant could not get out if he wanted to. This was virtually solitary confinement, and it lowered our morale with a vengeance. The strain on our nerves increased as nothing happened to interrupt the monotony over the next few days. I was hard put to keep up the spirits of my colleagues. Captain Kohler tried to gloss over our new predicament by suggesting that all this, the cell-like rooms, the barbed wire, the watchtowers, was being done in the interest of our security and safety. There was a further disappointment on the day after our arrival when Captain Boker came to see me. "I am sorry," he said, "but I won't be able to take care of you anymore, General. After tomorrow, Captain Waldman will be at your service." He did not seem to be too pleased about being taken off the case. As he did not enlarge this announcement, perhaps he was not permitted to, it only increased our uncertainty. Captain Eric Waldman arrived the next day. We went for a long stroll and talked, putting out cautious feelers and trying to find out more about each other. He seemed reliable and frank enough as a man. While he betrayed some reserve in consequence of the tragic fate of his family in occupied Europe, this by no means ruled out all prospects of his cooperating with us. We later became firm friends. For many years to come, he was to make a strong contribution to the success of our idea, and in many other ways he also helped the Tilda Youthful Federal Republic in West Germany, wherever he humanly could. His endeavours have since been recognised by the award of Germany's Federal Service Medal. Captain Waldman made it clear to us that the present somewhat harsh arrangements were the result of certain special circumstances, and he asked us not to lose heart. He would set things right as time went on. We gathered that this was an interrogation camp established for the exploitation of particularly important prisoners of war. The camp's commandant was an exceptionally ambitious officer, and he was piqued by the fact that we had been withdrawn from his tender mercies as far as exploitation was concerned. Every day, Waldman collected us from outside our accommodation block and drove us off, once to the Pentagon, for detailed conversations with experts of the War Department's G2 Division working under General George V. Strong. This provoked the camp commandant to try to get our goat by inflicting various petty infamies on us, such as the unaccustomed style of accommodation, in the hope that we would retaliate by refusing to cooperate with the Americans. Once the Pentagon had lost interest in us, he hoped we would be returned to his exclusive control, and he could then take the credit for exploiting our brains and abilities. When I learned this, I realized there were squabbles between various factions in America, no less than those that had hampered us in Nazi Germany. For the people in the line of fire, in this case us, it could be highly uncomfortable, but there was nothing to do but grin and bear it. After some time, Captain Waldman managed to get us different accommodations. We were given 3 little rustic cabins in the woods with no fence of any kind, and with complete freedom to move around on parole within certain geographical limits. In these huts we lived in 2s and 3s, and the limits were sufficient for us to move around in almost complete liberty in the free time that was given us. My professional mistrust prompted me to comb the 3 huts for hidden microphones, as I did not want the Americans to profit from every word we spoke in private. As expected, I found a microphone concealed in quite ingeniously contrived locations in each hut, so the next day I complained to Captain Waldman. I assumed these bugs had found their way in with his knowledge, and I suggested that for security reasons alone, it seemed inappropriate to permit listening devices to be operated against us, since the other end was probably monitored by some NCO who might well jeopardize our plan by revealing our true identities on the outside. Waldman was furious about the microphones. "It's incredible," he exclaimed. "I'm going to find out who's responsible for this." It turned out that the camp commandant had ordered the bugs installed to keep an eye on Captain Waldman. No doubt he hoped to glean enough information in this way to compromise his rival for good. I now know that after Boker had brought us across the Atlantic, he reported to the Pentagon, where no one understood that he had reconstituted a working intelligence organization of potentially great importance. The Russian section of the Army's G2 branch then took over from him, and they confirmed at once that we were essential to the future security of the United States. But for policy reasons, it was out of the question to develop our organization. The most that G2 could do was to interrogate us in minute detail and exploit our documents. Given the circumstances, it was very fortunate that Waldman was a good friend of Baker's and committed himself to our preservation as a group with the same enthusiasm. For the Pentagon made it very clear to Boker that unofficial visits to us at Fort Hunt were frowned on. He retired from the Army a frustrated man, visiting us once more in our quarters shortly before Christmas, with little tokens, mostly pocket knives his firm had manufactured. We later sent him a card to which were sewn a number of foreign coins as a token purchase price for the knives. We did this so that, as the superstition goes, our friendship would not be cut. We were repeatedly visited by experts from the War Department who wanted to get an idea of our plans and capabilities. The director of one of these study groups was Colonel Lovell, who was later unfortunately killed in action in the Korean War. Before World War II, he had been military attaché in Berlin, and he used to tell people how correctly he had been treated while interned by our Wehrmacht while awaiting repatriation to America after Pearl Harbor. He assured me he would do his utmost to see we were not handled one bit worse in America. I learned to appreciate him as an upright American soldier with whom it was possible to talk frankly about everything. Their expert on Russia was also a particularly capable man, benefiting from an excellent judgment on all Eastern affairs. The work that was required of us consisted of answering questionnaires on the Soviet Union's armed forces and writing studies based on the material made available to us. As time passed, we were handed more and more material for evaluation and analysis, and the results we turned in gradually convinced the Americans that we were capable of everything we claimed. It was during this phase that I briefed those of my colleagues I had kept in the dark about my plans for the future, namely of creating an Eastern intelligence service on German soil using the same management as before, but with American backing. I well remember the astonishment some of them displayed. Only their good breeding and their trust in me kept them from speaking their minds to me there and then. Even at the end of 1945, when conversation with our American hosts came around to these same proposals, there was still an evasive reaction. Apparently, they still balked at the political hurdles that would have to be overcome. We were told we would have to wait until public hostility toward Germany had simmered down and the split with the Soviet Union had become more acute. The public had to come to grips with the Soviet problem first. Otherwise, in a democratically governed nation like the United States, there would be the most awkward outcome in both domestic and foreign politics. As late as December 1945, the Americans would go no further than offering to sanction counter-espionage work on a restricted scale by a unit directed by Hermann Baun, if I would agree. I gave them my approval, as this was the thin end of a wedge which would make it possible for us to enlarge the scope of our operations later on. At this time, Baun was being held by the CIC at a camp at Oberursel, a former Wehrmacht interrogation center not far from Frankfurt. The CIC knew nothing of the overall plans that were being laid at the Pentagon in connection with myself. One consequence of this was that Baun at first believed the CIC was granting him permission to start up operations on their own initiative, as a result of the proposals he had made. The Russians themselves were responsible for the final adoption of my plan. The foreign ministers of the four powers had agreed in London that all foreign troops should be withdrawn from northern Persia by March 2nd, 1946. But during October 1945, the first indications reached Washington that the Russians were in fact sending in additional troops. Reading the leading articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post, we could see American public opinion inching round to outright hostility toward Moscow. The final blow was struck in February 1946, as Russian troops occupied northern Persia in violation of the London Agreement. The dramatic about-face in American public opinion still took us by surprise, but it was explained to me in an idiom I still remember. The Americans don't like to be taken for suckers. Now at last, the people saw that the Soviet Union was a leopard which could never change its spots. This was a communist state which would never change to a peace-loving nation, differing only in form from the Western democracies. The attitude toward us changed. All at once we were offered a more detailed and fundamental level of cooperation. We were allowed to drive into the city of Washington, accompanied only by an American officer to interpret for us, for it was taking us longer to learn English than we had thought. From our pay as prisoners of war, we were able to make Tilda small purchases, and we were shown around Washington to see the sights and learn its history. Captain Waldman displayed a real concern for all our problems throughout this time. The months we spent together in Washington established a degree of mutual confidence between us that was to pave the way to the final success of our joint effort. By the middle of 1946, all the preparations had been made. On July 1st, 1946, we embarked on a Liberty ship, a troop transport, for our return voyage to Europe, and we berthed at Le Havre a week later. The weather had been magnificent for the entire crossing. Our good friend Captain Waldman had preceded us to Germany by 1 month, but he was to remain with us there for a long time to come as both friend and counsellor. Cramped though the confines of the troop transport were, we soaked up the sea air and the sunshine. We enjoyed the good food and spent the evenings on deck watching the films put on for the prisoners of war and crew. For the other prisoners outside our group, there must have been an agony of doubt and uncertainty as to what lay ahead of them. But our own morale could not have been higher. We were coming home to Germany, and we were on the threshold of a great new task. On April 1st, 1942, I was appointed head of Branch 12 of the German Army's General Staff. This branch was known as Foreign Armies East, and it was primarily concerned with gathering intelligence on our Soviet enemies. It was my first position of direct responsibility for any kind of intelligence work. My appointment resulted from the Chief of Staff's desire to see a change in the leadership of the branch. He was dissatisfied with my predecessor, and we were on the threshold of launching a major offensive in Russia toward the Volga and the Caucasus. Part of General Hal Diyar's motive for selecting me may have been that I had served as his personal staff officer from the end of 1939 until early 1940, and that I had subsequently worked on the planning for the new Caucasus offensive in the operations branch, right up to the date of my new appointment. I was therefore familiar with our objectives and military dispositions, and with our intermediate and long-term aims on the Eastern Front. For the first 20 years of my career as an officer, however, I had had virtually no contact with intelligence work. My first interest in the possibilities it afforded had been aroused in the years before the Munich crisis of 1938, during which I had served first in Branch 1 of the General Staff, Plans and Operations under Colonel Hansen, then in Branch 10 of the General Staff, Fortifications under Colonel von der Chevalerie, in which we were concerned with the theory and planning of German lines of fortification. This made it necessary for us to investigate what the other side was up to. Once I had to tour the frontier between Silesia and Czechoslovakia, together with a Lieutenant Colonel von Riesen to reconnoitre the Czech fortification works. Riesen was an officer of Admiral Canaris's Abwehr organization, attached to Military District 8 in Breslau. He travelled under the code name Schneider. We spent some days with the photographic units on the frontier, obtaining long-range shots of the Czech installations using a giant telephoto lens of about 1,000 mm focal length. By this means, we secured information on the thickness of the concrete at the sites even at ranges of 20 miles and more. This journey kindled my first interest in such work. And a decade later, when I became head of the organization in occupied Germany, I adopted the code name Dr. Schneider in memory of the lieutenant colonel who had performed this service, since he had by then passed on to a place where code names are no longer of any consequence. In the course of my work at the War Department building in Berlin's Bendlerstrasse, I established contact with figures who were already legendary, as well as those who were later to become notorious. Among the former, I valued most highly my acquaintance with General Ludwig Beck, Halder's predecessor as Chief of the Army's General Staff. He was constantly looking for new methods and military tactics, emulating General von Seeckt in this respect. Seeckt had contended that in an armed conflict, Germany could have no hope of victory unless she could force her enemy into a fluid and mobile warfare from the start. Beck was aware of the possibilities of technology in modern war. He was modern in outlook, and immediately supported the introduction of the costly new assault gun after it was demonstrated to him, even though he could afford only one detachment in each division to be equipped with such weapons. He hated the Nazis and went out of his way to avoid them. He had only one personal meeting with Adolf Hitler, and that lasted only a few minutes. My recollection of the leading Nazis is only fragmentary. Heinrich Himmler once invited me to lunch alone, sounded me about my organization, and discarded me. In June 1938, I had my one and only meeting with Hermann Göring too. He had been ordered to inspect the army's fortification work along our western frontiers, and I was attached to the tour as a fortifications specialist to the staff of General Adam, the commander-in-chief in the West. The construction program had originally been planned on a magnificent scale by the War Department for eventual completion by 1964 as a permanent barrier in the West. But by mid-1938, of course, little of this program was completed. Göring made no secret of his criticism. Adam was normally a sanguine and receptive general, but after 2 days of Göring's onslaught he walked out, leaving me, a 36-year-old army captain, to represent the War Department's point of view. No sooner had I opened my mouth to answer Field Marshal Göring's criticism than he interrupted me, referred to me as young man, and silenced me. Afterward I spoke to his deputy, General Milch, one of the more upright and capable personalities in the Luftwaffe, and asked him to make it clear that as I was the only War Department officer present, I must be listened to. Milch must have spoken to Göring about it, because I was given a proper hearing after that. I later spoke to Halder, who was on the point of succeeding Beck, and told him I thought Hitler's orders to Fritz Todt, the engineer, to take over the fortification work from us was an ominous development. But it was symptomatic of the Führer's deep-seated mistrust for the General Staff and our specialized knowledge. He once said, "If I want a project to run smoothly, I always give the experts a wide berth." Undoubtedly, Hitler was characterized by a degree of misplaced genius, but it was that type of genius that is brilliantly successful in peacetime and crumples when it is confronted by the serious burdens of war. He was completely without scruples. Adolf Hitler lacked the training to understand fully military factors and strategic possibilities, but he nonetheless remained convinced of his genius as a warlord until the very end. He was supported in this belief by those of his subordinates who had emerged from the party. It was rooted in the fact that the first military decisions which Hitler adopted against the considered advice of his officers, the occupation of the Rhineland, the assimilation of Austria, the 2 Czech crises, and the initial campaigns of World War II, in Poland, Norway and France, were met with unqualified success, and thereby confirmed his predictions and apparently disproved the cavilling prognoses and calculations of General Halder. Thus, events at first served to strengthen Hitler's unjustified self-confidence and to throw the General Staff into sharp relief as a pack of pessimists and defeatists. But Hitler tended to base his decisions on the assumption that his enemies would act illogically, and this was a gamble which someday was bound to fail. Instead of weighing carefully each step he took, he began a dangerous poker game, and shut his eyes to the fact that sooner or later he would be dealt a losing hand. Even in 1939 he did not deserve to win. Our forces were nowhere near ready for war, and if the Allies had shown resolution in their political and military actions when war broke out, there would have been at most a short period of armed conflict, followed by the defeat of Germany, a defeat which seemed tilde certain from the outset. This claim may seem far-fetched, but in support I would mention that the Army's entire stock of heavy artillery ammunition, apart from heavy field howitzer ammunition, consisted of 8 12 trainloads, and that even by the summer of 1939, no significant production of this ammunition had commenced. At the end of the fighting in Belgium and northern France in early June 1940, there was only enough ammunition left for the light field howitzers. Our stocks of heavy artillery ammunition, including that of the heavy field howitzers, were virtually exhausted. Major Hasso von Etzdorf, a diplomat who was attached to my branch as liaison officer to the Foreign Ministry, once summed up Hitler's unrealistic logical processes with a bitter parody of the title of one of Schopenhauer's studies, The World as Will and Imagination. Etzdorf described Hitler's world as the world of will without imagination. From November 10, 1938, until the outbreak of war, I was battery commander in the 18th Artillery Regiment. When the Polish campaign began in September 1939, I was posted as operations officer to the 213th Infantry Division, a Landwehr reserve division, in which the average age of the troops was 45, and one of the regimental commanders was no less than 67. I was one of the 3 active officers temporarily assigned to this division. Apart from some fighting around Modlin, in which we acquitted ourselves with dignity, the campaign ended with little excitement for us. In October 1939, the General Staff recalled me to the Fortifications Branch at its headquarters in Zossen, south of Berlin, and I stayed there apart from tours of inspection along Germany's eastern and western frontiers until the eve of the German attack on France and the Low Countries. General Halder detailed me to act as Field Marshal von Brauchitz's liaison officer with the 16th Army, and to General Roth's armoured group, and then, during the second phase of the French campaign, I acted as liaison officer to General Guderian's Armoured Corps, which played a crucial role in the final collapse of France. Following this, for 3 months I accompanied General Halder as his adjutant, while Hitler went through the motions of preparing to invade the British Isles. From the very start, I had the clear impression that Hitler did not take Operation Sea Lion seriously, and this impression was strengthened from observations I was able to make as Balder's adjutant and, after October 1940, as head of Group East in the War Department's Operations Branch under Colonel Adolf Husinger. There were certain clues in Halder's behaviour that led me to conclude that Hitler regarded the entire Sea Lion plan as nothing more than a highly elaborate but very effective means of deceiving the Russians as to his real strategic intentions in the East, a decision Hitler had evidently reached some time before I was given Group East. Not even the Army Group commanders were privy to Hitler's real plans. Unpopular though this view may now be, I must state that I have no doubt that Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was correct, because it was inevitable. While Moscow had no firm plans to attack us before the Polish campaign of 1939, in which Stalin aided Hitler, by the time we attacked Russia in June 1941, the picture was very different. It was clear that Stalin had resolved to postpone his attack on his farmer ally only so long as was necessary to see us bleeding to death and exhausted after a conflict with the Western Allies. Then he would have grinned and attacked us as well, in the knowledge that the capitalist powers had meanwhile torn themselves to pieces too. He might have waited until 1943 or 1944, but my colleagues in Group East of the War Department and I were convinced he was going to attack sooner or later. The advanced state of the Soviet Union's preparations for an offensive war support this conviction. For example, the echeloned in-depth deployment of their divisions at the time of our attack indicated that they were putting together a powerful land force for an attack on us. The structure of their industrial economy led to similar conclusions as well. But if Hitler was correct in making this decision, what was wrong was the manner in which he conducted the Russian campaign. In this connection, I might add that the Führer nurtured something like a love-hate relationship with Joseph Stalin. When he was in difficulties, Hitler sometimes asked himself out loud, What would Stalin do in a situation like this? It was perhaps in emulation of Stalin that Hitler instituted the arrest of the relatives of certain conspirators in the assassination plot of July 20th, 1944. Among the conspirators who later paid with their lives was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the OKW's Abwehr intelligence organization. While I was Halder's adjutant, I came into frequent contact with the Admiral, for he had to pass through my office to reach Halder's. I soon learned, however, that my presence was not desired, for reasons of privacy as much as of security, and I tactfully withdrew. When I became head of Group East, working on the planning of Operation Barbarossa Hitler's attack on Russia, one of the proposals I made was for Abwehr units to be attached to the assault troops taking part in the attack, a suggestion Canaris warmly endorsed at a conference L attended in his offices late in 1940. Although I was only a major, he was always charming, receptive, and genuine. Later, our relationship deepened into one of great mutual trust and proximity. That Canaris's character is shrouded even now in mists of ill repute is a fate he shares with many other figures of the intelligence world both in Germany and abroad. He has been criticized by authors who obviously cannot have been acquainted with him. Canaris has been repeatedly accused of procrastination, lack of resolution, and doubtful conduct. The disclosures of certain treason cases have tended to leave stains on his reputation. But for my part, I am convinced that none of these vague and all too superficial histories has done the Admiral justice. In addition to his deep-seated religious feelings and his impeccable conduct as an officer, Canaris was endowed with intellectual traits not seen in officers since the first half of the 19th century. Traits that had helped officers like Roon, von der Goltz, and Count York von Wartenberg, as well as Clausewitz and Moltke, to spectacular achievements in sciences other than the purely military. Moreover, unlike many officers, Canaris knew how to think in global terms. This was how he was able to predict political trends with uncanny accuracy. Admittedly, he did not always find the right audience-men who were as ready and willing to listen to his prophecies as were Fritsch, Brauchitsch, Beck, and Halder. But this was a fate he shared with more than one of his colleagues. It was hardly surprising that as war broke out in 1939, he had taken a very pessimistic view of the outcome, and that the mantle of a Cassandra had lain heavy on his shoulders. Canaris was a convinced opponent of the Nazis. Like General Beck, he suffered deeply from the internal conflict wrought by the military oath he had sworn in God's name and by his opposition to the regime. The fact that Germany was caught up in a life-and-death struggle, and that, in the event of defeat, Germany as a whole would have to suffer, and not just the Nazis, only intensified this inner torment. I recall a long private talk I had with Canaris in 1942, in which he discoursed at length on the concepts of treachery and high treason, arriving at the conclusion that only the latter could be justified, even given the exceptional circumstances of the war Germany's leaders were now fighting. But Canaris added that the perpetrators had to recognize that only one thing would guarantee justice to the conspirators, that the plot must succeed. And they also had to realize that until success was achieved, they and their relatives would be exposed to grave risk. He acted accordingly, gathering into the Abwehr numerous figures endangered because of their political beliefs, rescuing them from the grasp of the Gestapo, and he set the seal on his beliefs after hideous torture, as we know from the survivors of Flossenburg concentration camp, by execution on April 9, 1945.